become the people that God wants us to be, if we're going to become the church that we need to be, it consists of the individuals that are taking this stuff seriously and getting into God's Word and understanding what He's saying and spending time in prayer and sharing Christ with the lost and all of these different disciplines that we've been going through. This week we're going to take a look at Sabbath, and this may or may not be a 2-week series. Jim will be speaking next week, and God may be leading him in a little bit different direction, so he may be doing something different, but I'm pretty excited to hear what Jim has for next Sunday. So this may turn into a 1-week study on the Sabbath, but let me just have you to think in your minds, well, when you hear the word Sabbath, what do you think of? Because today it's not a real big popular thing. It's not something that's talked about a lot. In fact, I don't know if I've ever heard a message preached on the Sabbath. I've had it in classes where we talk about it, or at conferences, especially for pastors. They really emphasize the need for us to Sabbath and to take this time to be alone with God. But I just wonder, not everyone, if I were to ask 10 different people what they think about Sabbath, I may very well get 10 different answers because there's just not a lot of clarity. And again, it's not something that's talked about often. But it is truly one of the disciplines that is so important. In fact, as we look through the Old Testament, which we're going to do in just a few minutes, we're going to see how important this subject was to God. When He decided to call a people to His own. We talked a little bit about the Abrahamic covenants before. We're going to look a little at the Mosaic covenants, the covenant between God and Moses today. And within it is this idea of Sabbath that was very, very important. So important that if you didn't keep it, you could be killed. And we'll look at that because that doesn't sound very loving. It doesn't seem very caring. It seems quite harsh. But we'll see in the Old Testament when God said something about putting together a nation of people that were going to be His people, that were going to represent Him here on the earth to all the other nations. He wanted them set apart and holy. He wanted everything about them to be different than anywhere else. And that's why they had such strict guidelines and laws that they needed to follow. So we'll look at that in just a second. Why don't we just open up in a word of prayer before we get going here. Lord, I know this is a short subject, a short time to be teaching on something that is very important and vital to us. So Lord, help me to do the justice that it deserves and give a good explanation of what Sabbath means back in the day and even today to us here in the year 2020, Lord. There's so much to say about Sabbath, and I want to make sure that I'm hitting the best points. But Lord, help us to see today that there is a greater understanding that we need to have, a greater appreciation, and a greater need to have Sabbath in our lives. Because it's something that was given to you, or given to us by you as a gift. And a lot of times we just don't look at that, especially in our busy everyday lives. So, Lord, let us focus right now on this all-important subject and really see what you have to say about it. In your name we pray. Amen. So when we look at the word Sabbath, it comes from the Hebrew word Shabbat, which literally means to stop working. And that is what God was calling people to do. But if we're going to do this justice, I want to do a couple of things today in our study of Sabbath. First, I want to give a good historical background of how the Sabbath came about. So we're going to look at a number of Old Testament passages and how Sabbath changed just a bit throughout those times. Then we're going to look at how Jesus observed the Sabbath and what He had to say about it. See, He had quite a bit to say about the Sabbath. And then we're going to look at the end. We're going to kind of wrap it all up with a practical teaching on what does that mean for us today? How does it apply? Is it the same as back in the times of the Old Testament? Is it different? Do I need to have this in my life? What's so big? How does it affect me today? So hopefully walking out of here, I'm going to give you some guidelines for how we should celebrate Sabbath in our own lives and practical suggestions. But really what it comes down to, it will be you making these calls. I can't tell you what Sabbath will be for you. But I can share kind of what God is doing with me in it and give other suggestions on things that you can add in there. But ultimately, this is going to be a decision between you and God. So I hope that's just a quick preview of where I hope to go. But if we're going to look at Sabbath, I need to turn this on. And we have to get back to the beginning. When we look at the creation story back in Genesis, we see the model of Sabbath taking place in creation itself. Genesis 2, 1 through 3 says this. So the creation of the heavens and the earth and everything in them was completed. On the seventh day, God had finished his work of creation, and so he rested from all of his work. And God blessed the seventh day, and he declared it holy, because it was the day when he rested from all his work of creation. So as we look right there, I'm going to put that back up just so you can kind of look at those words. We can see this idea of 6 working days and then a day of rest. Now, you guys all know that we have 7 days in our week. And if you were to look at your calendar, when we talk about Sabbath, the Sabbath actually, during the Old Testament times and well into the New Testament, would be on Saturday. Because the first day of the week, as we would look at it, would be on a Sunday. And if you look at your calendar, I know a lot of times we don't think the week starts until Monday, because Sunday's part of the weekend, and then the new week starts. But if you look at your calendar, every calendar I've seen, the first day is always Sunday. And then Saturday would be the 7th. We'll talk a little bit about that transition and why, and if it's completely necessary to do things on a Saturday or a Sunday, or either one of them as we go on. But here we can see that there were 6 days that God took for creation. And he worked. He spoke things into creation. And the 7th day, he said, all is good. And he rested. And he declared that day holy. What is the significance of that? Well, we're going to look on as we go into the book of Exodus. Now, in Exodus, just to give you a little background, and I'm sure most of you in here know this, but just want to give you a little bit. This is when Moses was leading the people out of Israel. The Red Sea had already happened. They had crossed, and they were headed to the Promised Land. Okay, and the people, well, we'll get right into it in just a second, but the people are starting to complain because they're saying, whoa, you led us out of Egypt, and now we have nothing to eat. You know, this journey from Egypt to the Promised Land really should have taken about a month, if that. But there were about 2.5 million people, so I guess it does take some time to move that many people. I try to think of that in my head, 2.5 million people. What would that look like? You've seen with some of the marches and the protests lately, and they show pictures of the Capitol, and you just see this sea of people going back. And, you know, that's really probably at most 100,000. But that's an awesome picture. If any of you guys have seen that on the news, just the picture itself, to see 100,000 people gathered in the streets, and you look from high above, and you see, wow, it's just people for as far as you can see. Can you imagine 2.5 million? I know I just went off track a little bit, but that just blows me away to think of that massive amount of people that was moving. How long it would take just to go 1 mile with that many people, because, I mean, it's just never-ending line. Anyhow, Moses was leading them out of Egypt into freedom. The Promised Land was upon them, which was part of the Mosaic covenant, that God was going to give them a land of their own, and he was going to provide everything. It was going to be flowing with milk and honey. It was going to be everything they could want. But there were conditions. The Mosaic covenant had some conditions upon man, and it would depend on the obedience of the people. And this is key, because the obedience of the people, one of the main things that we're going to see as we look through the Old Testament about Sabbath, is the people, when they stopped caring about the Sabbath and keeping it holy as God told them, that would kind of depend on the plight of Israel. We'll see that as we go through this. But right now, let's pick it up in Exodus chapter 16, 21 through 30. After this, the people gathered the food morning by morning, each family according to its need. And as the sun became hot, the flakes they had not picked up melted and disappeared. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much as usual, 4 quarts for each person instead of 2. Then all of the leaders of the community came and asked Moses for an explanation. Now, I'll stop right there for a second, because God was providing them food. Now, as they came out of Israel, we know that they had lots of flocks and animals and lots of supplies that they were going to be needing for their journey. We don't know how long this was into that journey, but obviously they did not, for whatever reason, they were not using their animals for food, or maybe not as much. But they cried out against Moses, and we've heard this all before. What, have you let us out here so that we would die? At least we should. The Egyptians, we were fed, and we had places to stay, and they were complaining. So God heard their cries, and he began to provide food for them. When the sun would come out, there would be bread on the ground, and they can go and they can gather what they needed. Obviously, it's specific on what they should have. 2 quarts for each person in the family. Uh, and if they tried to hold on to it overnight, if they gathered more because they didn't trust that God would take care of them the next day, they tried to gather more, it would rot and it would turn to maggots. Okay? So God was very serious. Don't take more than you need. I'm going to be your sustenance. He wanted them to realize He is their leader. He is the one that's taking care of all of their needs. So here they were asking Moses for an explanation, and he told them, this is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow will be a day of complete rest, a holy Sabbath day set apart for the Lord. So bake or boil as much as you want today, and set aside what is left for tomorrow. So they put some aside until the morning, just as Moses had commanded. And in the morning, the leftover food was wholesome and good without maggots or odor. Again, those who tried that beforehand, tried to save some for later, it would rot and turn to maggots and it would stink. Here, Moses is saying, I want you to get double what you'll need for the next 2 days and keep it. And they did that and it didn't rot. Moses said, eat this food today, for today is a Sabbath day dedicated to the Lord. There will be no food on the ground today. You may gather the food for 6 days, but the 7th day is the Sabbath. There will be no food on the ground that day. Some of the people went out anyway on the 7th day, but they found no food. Then the Lord asked Moses, how long will these people refuse to obey my commands and instructions? They must realize that the Sabbath is the Lord's gift to you. That is why He gives you a 2-day supply on the 6th day, so there will be enough for 2 days. On the 7th day, you must each stay in your place. Do not go out to pick up the food on the 7th day, so the people did not gather any food on the 7th day. So again, God was telling them, you know what? 6 days you have to work. You can go out and you gather. Don't take more than you need. I'm going to give you everything. Put your full trust in me. And if you start to trust yourself to have this little rainy day fund or a little something on the side just in case God doesn't provide, He's going to show you, no, you are going to be wrong, and it's going to stink, and it's going to turn into maggots. And who wants that by Him? I can't stand the sight of maggots. Whenever I open up my garbage in the summer, and sometimes you get that awful smell, and yeah, those creepy things are crawling around. They make me sick. Can you imagine have them near all your stuff? Ugh, that would be terrible. So He was saying, put your full trust in me. I've got your back. And He's like, look back at creation. Even I rested. This is my gift to you. You don't have to work on this day. And again, remember, they were in slavery in Egypt for all of those years. They never got a day off. They didn't have a Sabbath where they can just rest and recharge and rejuvenate and have themselves completely taken care of. And God is saying, this is a gift to you. So don't worry about it. Put your full trust in me and I will take care of everything you need. And this was a modeling of that. So Moses had to tell them, especially those who went out looking, hey, get it right. Because God, you could see, was ticked off with his answer right there. He said, how long will these people not trust me? Remember some of the things that they had already seen. They'd seen all the plagues that led Pharaoh to set them free. They'd seen the Red Sea open up. They were led by a cloud in the day and a pillar of fire at night. This should have been something that says, hey, when this guy speaks and he tells Moses something who tells us something, we ought to listen. And this was ticking God off because he was saying, hey, trust me. I've got everything that you need. Rest, Sabbath. Rest in me and enjoy this gift that I am giving you as people. So as we go to Exodus 20, this is a particular chapter that most of us know, but you may not know what's in there yet. This is where the 10 Commandments are. And when we think about Sabbath, a lot of people don't know what the full 10 Commandments are. We know that we have them. We probably know some of the big ones. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. Well, one of them is to observe the Sabbath. The 4th commandment says that we should observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. As it says right here, remember to observe the Sabbath day by day, keeping it holy. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons, your daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, and any foreigners living among you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. But on the 7th day he rested. That is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. So now as God gives his commandments to the people, remember Moses up on the mountain, met with God, and And God had this awesome, spectacular way of writing with his very own finger on some tablets that Moses was to break down. Well, when God, these are the only things that God himself penned. He used people to do the rest of it. But this part of Scripture, he wrote with his own hand. The Ten Commandments, something that was so sacred, they would carry it in the Ark of the Covenant. They couldn't touch it. It was something that was always with them. The rest of the scrolls that they would be kept on the outside of the Ark. But the actual tablets that were written, the Ten Commandments were written on, were in the Ark of the Covenant that no one would ever be able to see. They were they were sacred. They were holy. And when God says something completely by himself, he means it. So these Ten Commandments were really, really important. As we'll see, they can be punishable by not following them by death. And the fate of Israel would hang in the balance. So he was very serious about the Sabbath, keeping this holy, dedicated to him, so he can remember that they are his people, and everything that they have good and blessing in their lives came from him. Therefore, all the other nations that would watch them would say, what is it about these people that are different? But they would know that they are people of the God of Abraham. They were the ones that the God of Moses, who led them out of Egypt. Don't think that word didn't spread of what happened in Egypt. The rest of the world was hearing about this. As we'll look forward, some of these nations in the Promised Land heard about those things, and when they saw the Israelites coming, they shuddered in fear because they knew the power of their God. But it seems sometimes his own people, God's own people, were not observing what he had to say. And he was very strict about this. He wanted people to recognize what he was saying and enjoy this gift that he had given them. He wanted them to rest easy. He wanted them to live for him. And it was in his actual Ten Commandments that this would be set apart and holy. We're going to move on to the end of Exodus here. And we're going to talk about what God was telling Moses again. He says this, then the Lord gave these instructions to Moses, tell the people of Israel, be careful, again, the emphasis here, be careful to keep my Sabbath day, for the Sabbath is a sign of the covenant between me and you from generation to generation. It is given so you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy. This idea of being set apart. You must keep the Sabbath day, for it is a holy day for you. And here we go. Here's where we see how strict God is and how serious he is. Anyone who desecrates it must be put to death. Anyone who works on that day will be cut off from the community. Wow. If you don't take a day off, you could be punished by death. If you were found working when you shouldn't have been, you could be cut off from the community. Verse 15, you have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the seventh day must, good word there, must be a Sabbath day of complete rest, a holy day dedicated to the Lord. Anyone who works on the Sabbath must be put to death. The people of Israel must keep the Sabbath day by observing it from generation to generation. This is a covenant obligation for all time. Again, we look at that covenant with the Abrahamic covenant. Remember, God promised Abraham he would make him into a great and mighty nation, and all the conditions were on the side of God. Okay? God promised him, and it didn't matter. He knew that they would obey at times, disobey, but all of the results of that covenant were on God. But here in the Mosaic covenant, we see that God put some of the decision-making on man. And the blessings were conditional. When they obeyed God and they were living as they should, they would enjoy his great blessing. But when they did not, Israel would face calamity. Many times they were taken into captivity, as we'll look at just a little bit later. We'll talk about just a little bit later. So we can see that God is very serious about his regulations being set apart in honoring and keeping, remembering the Sabbath day. So this is a covenant obligation for all time. It is a permanent sign of my covenant with the people of Israel. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, but on the seventh day he stopped working and was refreshed. Now, as we go further from this point in history throughout the Old Testament, we will see, especially in the major prophets, what happened to Israel when they didn't. We all know that Israel had their ups and their downs. They would face great times of blessing, horrible times of calamity where they'd be taken from their land. Their cities would be destroyed. They would become slaves once again, cry out to God for deliverance, and he would send prophets to tell them, here's what you need to do. If you look in the prophets of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Nehemiah and Ezekiel, you'll see many times where they're either crying out to the people or reminding them to remember the Sabbath and all the good things. And in Psalms, you'll see that it's written on how to observe the Sabbath. So it's all over the Old Testament. And when they would return, there would be reminders to say, hey, remember what we were just through again. Remember to keep the Sabbath. Keep that day holy and honorable and blessed before God. And we can enjoy his blessing. So God is very, very serious about this in the Old Testament. Actually, the fate of the nation depended on it at all costs. So when we talk about Sabbath today, I hope we can have a greater appreciation for how much God intended for it to be followed. It was something that was very serious, because that is our heritage as well. Although we are not Jews in this room, at least I don't think anyone here has any Jewish heritage, we have been grafted into the family, and as we look back, that is the history of our faith. God is very serious when he tells us about doing things. So we're going to look in the New Testament now and just see, well, is it the same? Because many people will correctly say that when Jesus came, he established a new covenant. The Mosaic covenant was for a specific period of time, as we'll talk about kind of in a rep at the end, for a specific group of people. But now we want to see what Jesus had to say, because he is the one who ushered in the new command, or the new covenant. As we put our faith and trust in him, we can find that peace and rest that we were looking for through him, rather than observation of the law. So Jesus, in Mark chapter 2, 23 through 27, it says this: one Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples began to break off heads of grain to eat. But the Pharisees, we all know about them, the ones who are always causing trouble for Jesus, they said to Jesus, look, why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath? And Jesus said to them, haven't you ever read the scriptures where David, or what David did when he and his companions were hungry? If we look back, what David did and his companions were hungry, they were able to eat special bread. I think we're going to see that in the next part of this passage. But that was a big no-no. But Jesus is reminding them that God created the Sabbath for the people. Now the Pharisees had taken the Sabbath and they made it into something that it was never meant to be. It was actually a burden for the people. And they would lord it over them. These religious leaders, they now decided that they were the ones in charge of creating what's right and what's wrong, and they would establish the punishments, and they were harsh. They were merciless. But oftentimes they would be hypocrites. In another passage we're not going to look at, Jesus would say, if one of your sheep fell into a well on the Sabbath, would you not gather people to come and get it out, or would you leave it to the next day? It's like, you hypocrites. Because they were saying, basically, by their regulations, the only thing you could do on the Sabbath is really sit in a chair. Because if you did anything that constituted work, they would say that's a violation. And they were the ones who would exact some punishment upon you to correct you and show you how you were to live. But Jesus is saying, wait a minute, his disciples were just breaking off some grain to eat on their way, and that was constituted work. So Jesus was going to give them a new explanation on what the Sabbath meant. And as he started here in 25, he says, don't you read the scriptures where David and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God during the days when Abiathar was high priest. And he broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests are allowed to eat. He also gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said to them, the Sabbath, this is really important, the Sabbath was not made to meet the needs of people, or it was made to meet the needs of people and not to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. So he's saying a couple of things that are really huge here. He's saying, wait a minute, I'm the one who established the Sabbath. Sorry, not the mic there. I'm the one who set this whole thing up. You guys got it all wrong. You've twisted this into something it was never meant to be. You're lording it over people, keeping a burden on them, rather than understanding that Sabbath was meant for the people. It was meant for them to understand that they can rest and they can reflect and think of all the things that God has done and enjoy him as their king. Enjoy them as their leader. That he has set them apart from everyone else, and they can rest in that fact. That all of their needs were going to be taken care of, and they can reflect on that. They don't have to worry about the things that the rest of the world had to do. And what a great example that was for the rest of the world. The rest of the world was fearing God for a long time, and because they knew when God was with them, don't mess with these people. Don't dare mess with them, because we've seen what he's done throughout history when they were disobedient and they would allow the cultures or the customs of other kingdoms to come in, and they would forget the things of God. This is what would happen. Well, the Pharisees took it upon themselves to make sure that would never happen again. And they took it well out of the realms of what God had in mind. So Jesus was reminding them, hey, the Sabbath was made for us. It was made for us to rest. It was made for us to enjoy our God and give him thanks and focus on him for this time. In Matthew 11:28-30, this is a really neat passage because this comes right before he's going to go into two other controversies about the Sabbath when he was battling with the Pharisees. And this is a really important thing here because it kind of gives us what the Sabbath is all about. And this is where you'll hear how these things were being burdensome to the people. The rule of the Pharisees and them enforcing their version of what the law was really putting a burden on the people all the time. And they were beat down, and they weren't enjoying the Sabbath the way they were they were supposed to. So Jesus is going to straighten them out here. He says, come to me, all of you are weary and carry heavy burdens, and he's putting the focus on him now, I will give you rest. That's a bold statement there because he's telling them he is the Lord of the Sabbath. He is the one who created it all. Remember, that's blasphemy. For someone to equate themselves with God, a mere human that was defying the power of the religious leaders, this is going to get him in big trouble. But he's saying, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, not the religious leaders, but let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle in heart. A whole new thing. These Pharisees were not humble. They weren't full of mercy. They weren't loving. They were all about power, rule, and authority for themselves. But Jesus is saying, here, take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I'm humble and gentle in heart. And you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light. So what we're seeing here is a transition from the Old Testament law, where the regulations were there in order to establish a people that the nations would look at and say, these are the people of God. They are separate. They are different. And now Jesus is coming in the world. And remember, his plan is to bring the rest of the nations in. According to the Abrahamic covenant, as we remember, God said, through this nation that I'll have myself, I will bless the rest of the world. This is what is happening right here. And Jesus is giving a new explanation about this new covenant that he's going to make, that is going to be written in his blood. That he is coming to set the captives free. He is coming to take the burdens away. And this is going to, frankly, include us today and what we should be thinking about the Sabbath. So the question is, what does this all mean? And I can go through a few other passages because there's a whole lot of things where Jesus is talking about the Sabbath and kind of rethinking what this looks like, talking about this new covenant. So the question is, what does this mean? Because as we look, we see, if you look at Orthodox Judaism, they still practice the Sabbath. They are still very vigilant. Remember, they don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. They don't believe that he is the one who came. So they completely have nothing to do with the New Testament, what it has to say, or more importantly, what Jesus had to say. They still observe that because they're still waiting for the Messiah that they believe is going to come yet. But as we know, Jesus is that Messiah. He is the one that was sent by God. And when he laid down his life, there was a new covenant written with his blood that we can find that Sabbath rest that we're all looking for. And it said that the rest for our souls through his blood. So as he came, we know that he said that he didn't come to abolish the law, which again would be the law of Moses made in that covenant with God. He came to fulfill it. So now there's a new understanding on what the Sabbath means for us today. So when we ask this question, because there's a lot of confusion, a lot of people say, well, what does it mean, Joe Pa, exactly? How do I keep the Sabbath and honor God? If I don't keep it, am I going to lose my life? Or am I going to bring calamity on myself? And my answer would be no. No. There is not a requirement that on this day of every week that you should be keeping the Sabbath. And as we're going to see here, I'm going to use some of the words of the Bible Project writers because it was a fantastic thing that they put it in words that are much easier to understand, and they're very clear about it. And this is the truth. As followers of Jesus, we aren't required to follow the laws given to Israel by God exactly. Meaning the Old Testament laws, they are not something that we have to be so rigid about and follow anymore. Jesus came and changed all of that. He wrote a new covenant. But these were given at a specific time to a specific group of people for a specific purpose. Yet the wisdom of those laws is enduring, and the law of the Sabbath is pure gold. It is not a commandment we are bound to. It is a promise that we are now invited to. So the Sabbath is something that we should implement in our lives for our own spiritual well-being, and really for our own physical well-being as well, our mental well-being, our social well-being. This is something that I want to encourage you guys to put in your life. But as we look at America today, we are so busy all the time. We become workaholics in so many spheres of life. I know for a long time as a youth pastor, I enjoyed the fact that I was single, and I really never took any time off. Here and there, I might take a vacation, but it would not be uncommon for me to do something 7 days a week. And as a single man, I kind of enjoyed that because it kept me out and doing things. But I'll tell you this, as I got older, when I got here, I was a little older and further along in my career, I began to value this just a bit more. And if you were to go to some of the pastors' conferences that we go to, for those of us in ministry, they say it is even more important that we take time off. And again, it doesn't have to be the specific day. In fact, because most pastors work on Sunday, obviously, they tell us to take another day of the week off. And I will tell you this, our church has been very good about this. Our leadership has. Because as I was contemplating this, I was in a meeting with Jim and Sasha and Jeremy, and I said, you know what, guys, I probably have to start taking a week off because obviously now things have changed for me. I have a family. I at the time had one child. I was working most days and 3 to 4 nights a week because, again, I was serving as the youth pastor during that time as well. And said, I'm not going to be able to give the care and time to my family if I don't start taking more time off. And I will say this. I said, I just don't know what to do. They were so adamant about saying, no, you must take a day off. They kind of finished it for me and said, this isn't something you need to consider. This is something you need to do. Because they don't want me to burn out, and they want me to make sure that I am doing what God has called me to do with my family. Being the right husband I need to be. Being the right father that I need to be. But getting away from the work of ministry. And I will tell you guys, ministry work is difficult. Jim is in the process. He'll be becoming one of our pastors next month. We'll be having a service to invite Jim onto our staff as a full-fledged pastor. But in our talks, Jim he says a lot of times, like, I don't know how you guys do this, because he talks to more pastors and he reads more accounts of pastors. He sees ministry ain't easy, and he sees the things that go on behind the scenes that most of you don't see. How do you do this all the time? I said, well, we don't always want to. It is a calling that God has given. But beyond ministry, God has called each one of you into full-time ministry. It just isn't vocational. God has called you to be his ministers all the time. So this is not just something for pastor. I would say every one of us needs to make sure we are taking this time. If you can't take a full day, take a half day. If you can't take a half day, sometimes make sure you take a couple of hours. But it is important that we take this time of rest. Now, what am I doing with my time? I take Mondays off. So if you ever do call on a Monday, it doesn't mean I won't answer or respond to your text or email. And don't be afraid to do that, especially if there's an emergency, make sure you do call me. But on Mondays, usually I'm going to either say, well, can we take care of that another day? Because I'm usually home with my family. And once a month, I even send the kids to daycare, so it's just me and God. Because I just need that break. And Rachel takes Wednesdays off, and we made that decision a couple months ago that on Wednesday, or once a month, she is then going to send the kids to daycare on Wednesday, so she can have her day of just her and God, or just recharging and reflecting on things that we need, because Sabbath is important for each one of us. So if you can't take a full day, or even have to take a few hours, and what I would say is unplug from the world. I would say get rid of everything that we have and try to focus on God. So what do I do on Mondays? Well, I'm going to actually be changing things, because in my study of Sabbath, it's brought some things to my attention that I need to do that really clutter up my day. So Monday is tomorrow, and I'm going to take most of it off. I am doing a wedding tomorrow. For those who know, Jesse Leyland is getting married to Josh Goodman tomorrow. It's going to be really cool. So I am coming in to do that. But I'm taking Friday off because the daycare is going to be closed because it's right before July July 4th, and most people are traveling, so the daycare will be closed. So I'll be taking Friday off, which then will be starting my vacation the following week. I'm going to be off. Again, not that you can't call, so we're not going anywhere, but I will have instructions on kind of who to talk to if you need certain things, but I am still available. But during this time off on Mondays, what I'm going to do is I'm instituting a few things to take out of my life so I can replace them with better things. And this is where the practical end comes in, because I can't tell you what you should do during your time of Sabbath. Okay? I can't say this, this, and this. I'm not a Pharisee, and I'm not your boss. Okay? I'm your pastor, so I want you to decide on what are the things that get in the way between you and God. What are the things that rob you of your time with Him? So what are some things for me? On Mondays, I'm not going to watch the news anymore. Okay? I am a news junkie. I talk about that a lot. I love political news. And if I'm, like, especially in the evening, as soon as Rach goes to bed, because I have to DVR them because she's really not into politics like I am, I'm ready to watch my news. But a lot of times when I'm with the kids on Mondays, I'll have the news on in the background so I can pay attention to what's happening. So I said, you know what? I'm going to eliminate the news on Mondays. On my Sabbath day, that is going to go out. And what I'm going to do is in the background, I'm going to have some Christian music playing. Or I'm going to read some Psalms.